Hi, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's got their cup of coffee. We got a very difficult task ahead. We had 2 to 3 p.m. slot where mild melatonin levels have actually gone up a bit. But we're also right after the exciting session with the lady speakers, and of course with the speech by Mr. Alvin Tan. But I think it's a very interesting topic that we have here, Dancing with Giants, talking about US and China and how Singapore fits in within that environment. Let's kickstart this panel discussion so we have a lot of time for questions from the floor and also questions among us as well. But I'm glad to have here with us Dr. Ho Yi, Deborah, and Chua Hak Bin, who are eminent and experienced. Among them, they have experience across the board from the private sector, Ho Yi from MAS, Investment Authority or in Middle East, as well as Emerald. And then Deborah, very experienced coverage about trade, regional trade, and the US economy as well. So maybe I start off with Deborah to set off the context for this panel. International politics has shifted from unipolarity to bipolarity, and I think, as mentioned by Roger just now early in the morning, multipolar. I think social discontent is widespread around the world. I think it stems from the unequal distribution of globalization and its costs and benefits, but also accompanied by US-China strategic rivalry. So I think I want to ask Deborah first to set the context. What is the potential impact of these developments, especially on the future of the Indo-Pacific regional trade? And what's your view? I think it's useful for us to get to understand a bit the globalization trend, this regionalization sort of trend that's happening now, and what is your outlook, and when will it end, Deborah?
Wow, that's a lot of questions. Let's see what I can do with that. I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you all for paying attention right after lunch. The situation is a bit challenging, but also has some opportunities in it for Singapore and ASEAN because we are experiencing changes, as all of you, of course, are very much aware. We already had pressures coming from the previous US administration headed by Donald Trump, which was radically different from anything that had gone before, as I'm sure, again, all of you are very much aware. And the policies that were pursued by the US under the Donald Trump administration were highly unusual, particularly in the economic sphere. I'm not going to talk now about politics and security. I'm just going to talk about economics and trade. And those policies were quite different. Where the US had, as we heard earlier today, sort of built this mansion and then helped others live in that mansion, the mansion being all of these different arrangements that we had to take care of stability and order. The US was now, particularly under Donald Trump, taking a sledgehammer to most of that mansion and reserving the pieces that were left in the rubble for the US and the US only. That is something we had not seen before, and it's unclear whether that will continue into the future, but it was very different. And that led to a very different sense of how you create relations with others, including between the US and China. And for a region here in Singapore and ASEAN that has built its own economic prosperity and growth on the basis of access to that mansion, to keep this analogy going, that's very problematic. If the mansion collapses, then what is it that a small country like Singapore in a region like ASEAN can do? The good news, I think, is that Singapore has had a lot of long-standing effort, working sometimes on its own, sometimes with its ASEAN colleagues, to develop alternative structures, to develop different ways of managing, especially trade and economic issues. That has helped create more diversified outcomes, lowered the risk, increased certainty for Singapore and this region. That was done before we had this level of sort of chaos and uncertainty, but I think it was in many ways sort of visionary that this could in fact happen at a time when no one was expecting it, and has led to, as Alvin Tan mentioned earlier, a series of integration efforts, again, largely led by Singapore, but also with the rest of ASEAN, to try to diversify those risks, to build alternative mansions, to use the stones from some of them to build a new mansion, to try to shore up the one that we had and in the ways that it might be useful, and to keep that sort of economic growth and recovery taking place in this region. So there are opportunities for Singapore and ASEAN, but it is also more challenging because in this new world, whatever this new world looks like, post-COVID, all sorts of challenges that we face, it's not yet obvious what it is that you need to do in order to be successful. There are clearly going to be pockets of opportunity, but there are going to be some serious risks and challenges, especially for such an export-oriented, globally exposed location as Singapore and the broader ASEAN region. So there are opportunities, I'm sure we'll get into this, but there are also some risks that are serious that should not be discounted as we think about what this world looks like when the mansion is crumbling and we're not sure whether it gets rebuilt or it gets completely dismantled or what happens.
So, Deborah, so what I gather from you is that the mansions will still be there, but there are new mansions being built in different districts.
Yes.
For example, the IPEF is a new district. We're not sure what's in that district, but we know that there's going to be a few mansions being built there. So is the latest Indo-Pacific framework, the IPEF, I think we'll go there first before we ask from Ho Yi and Chua Hat Pin on that. So I think it's quite key because it's quite new, this IPEF.
Yes. So let me start with the existing mansion. So the existing mansion on the trade side, at least, is anchored by the World Trade Organization. And I know almost none of you, I'm sure, this would depress me if I asked, so I'm not going to ask. Almost none of you realize that they're about to have a huge meeting next week that will have changes that may make differences to you, including you as investors. So one thing in particular, let me just mention as we're watching the crumbling of the mansion that matters, is we may lose a very technical thing that can matter a great deal, potentially to bankers and investors, which is a customs moratorium on electronic transmissions. Okay, now that sounds like it has nothing to do with anything that you do all day long. But really what that is, customs duties are tariffs. And if we've had any bright spot over the last few years of the Trump administration, everybody seems to know what a tariff is now. But those tariffs are applied on goods. So currently now tariffs are on clothing and chairs and water bottles. But they're not applied to services. They're not applied to digital services, especially digital banking, digital finance, overseas investment, et cetera. There's no tariffs on that. Partly because we've had this rule created in the 1990s that has prohibited governments from putting in a customs tariff on electronic transmissions or digital services. Regularly that has gotten renewed. You shall not do that. That's about to fall. And it's about to fall because some of the countries in this neighborhood really want to collect customs duties or tariffs from digital services, like Indonesia and India, two examples of countries that are pushing for the collapse of the moratorium. It's unclear right now how we're going to pay tariffs on cross-border digital delivery, everything from downloads of books and music and software to streaming services to there's a giant category in Indonesia called other, which could be all banking, all insurance, all investment money. It is unclear. So I just want to flag for you while I have your attention that this thing could potentially be a big deal and will be deeply problematic for a number of companies and nobody's paying attention to it, which is what happens when nobody pays attention to the big mansion and they focus on the new neighborhoods, right? They don't want to live in the old place. They want something shiny and new. So pay attention to the old one because it may make a difference to you. In the shiny and new category, if we're talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for the United States, that is a very different kind of agreement. It's not like any house that we've built before. There are ways to imagine that this is going to be amazing, and there are ways to imagine it will be really nothing. So let me give you the positive and then briefly the negative side of this. On the positive side, the way that IPEF is supposed to work, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is the US and some allies, including Singapore and Australia, Japan, many of the ASEAN countries, India, are thinking about this at the moment. Is there's sort of 4 pillars of activity that you could join. One of them is on supply chains. One of them is on something around climate, still unclear what. One of them, which might affect you all in the room again, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere, so I'm not worried about it, is on tax and anti-corruption. And then one of them is a pillar that's more about traditional trade stuff, digital trade, environmental trade, labor and human rights. So there's 4 pillars of activity. And the idea behind this is that we're going to do something different and innovative and potentially, especially I would say in the climate pillar, maybe you could do new things to actually get at some of those climate and ESG related goals that you talk about, but is hard to deliver on. So there could be something very exciting happening on the IPEF. Alternatively, because it's new and it's weird, and because you require like a collaborative outcome and it's kind of pick and choose, think of it as a buffet where you get to eat some or none or whatever. For most of that activity, most countries could just say, I'm not hungry, I'm not having any of it. And then we get nowhere. So it could go very, very well. It could go nowhere. But the idea is let's try something different because we can see that the current structure is not working and these new neighborhoods are far more interesting.
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, I'll probably follow up on this question later on, especially when it's actually an alternative to what of the other frameworks that we've seen that are set. But we'll discuss that later. But I just want to go on to Ho Yi. Ho Yi, Dr. Ho, you're the chief economist in EMRO. You've traveled in the region. You've probably seen the developments in ASEAN more extensively and more in depth. So what's your view on this China and US relations? And do you think the ASEAN economies can sort of juggle this bifurcated world of the multipolar going forward? And how will this affect ASEAN +3 growth? And I think the key thing is, if you can share with us, what are the risks and challenges? I think those would be very useful. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. Well, first, very glad to be here. And thanks for inviting us to participate in this. So let me just start with this. Does it work? There, okay. So I'm Chief Economist at ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office. This is the equivalent of the IMF in the region. So as Andy said, we do assessment of the countries in the region very intensively. We visit them once a year, sometimes 2-3 times a year. And we identify risk vulnerabilities in those countries, and then we give an assessment of the kind of policies they should follow. So we've been very closely monitoring the region, and it's a very troubled region. This morning I heard Minister Alvin said, you're moving from the frying pan into the fire, and maybe the house is on fire. But yeah, it's not burned down yet, and we're still trying to see whether you can salvage it. So this is what we normally start with in EMRO. We sort of identify the risk as I mentioned. And here you can see there are 6 bubbles. So those are what we consider to be the main risks facing the region. I mean, there are many more risks, but those are the key ones that we see. So as you can see, the supply chain disruption is one of them. Another is the financial distress in the private sector, and I think Minister Alvin Tan alluded to that in his speech also. But the most recent one that is front out is this war in Ukraine, right? Just when we were finalizing our flagship report, the war broke out, and we had to scramble to try to identify, how it affects the outlook and our forecast for the year. And then, of course, we have the COVID. We were coming out of it for the last 2 years. We've been battling this COVID, and unfortunately now we have this war in Ukraine, and it's sort of poses risk as well as uncertainty on the outlook. But we already see the impact on the region. Fortunately, we are quite far away from the war, and so we're feeling the impact indirectly through high commodity prices, food, and also fertilizers and all the commodity prices. And finally, the sovereign debt distress, which is a concern that many analysts have, that because of the ramp up in fiscal policy in the last 2 years to support the economy, countries have accumulated a lot of debt, and that could become a vulnerability or a risk going forward. So of the 3, I mean, they are interrelated. They are not distinct, but they are certainly not overlapping completely, right? And so I guess, for instance, the war in Ukraine has led to a very high commodity prices, and inflation are already picking up across the region. And so even in the region, you can see that inflation has picked up quite a bit for some countries in the region. So for this year, we expect inflation to be in the region of about 4.5%, 5% for several countries, which is high, but not as high as when you compare to other countries in other parts of the world, like in Latin America or US and Europe. And the reason is because even though inflation is picking up, we're coming from a very low base, as you can see. Some countries are, struggling to get inflation up. Um, and so for the first time, we see inflation rising by sort of overshooting what we want. But much of the inflation is caused by supply shock, what we call supply shock, because of the sanction on Russia. So that has led to a shortage of fuel. Oil prices have gone through the roof, and also grain. So the region, on the other hand, right, was hit by the Delta infection last year, and that sort of derailed the recovery. Okay, so in terms of economic activity, we're actually coming from a low base. So unlike the US and Europe, which came out very strongly last year, the region actually is coming from a low base, and so we expect growth this year to be relatively strong. Okay, and a lot of people ask whether we are behind the curve because inflation has gone up and central bank seems to be quite complacent. Our view is that they have room to be a bit more complacent, but at the same time, I think it's time to begin to normalize the monetary policy and withdraw the stimulus, because if the recovery is strong enough, there's no reason why they should keep interest rate very low, and they should start tightening and raising the rates now, so that you have room. If the economy would falter or stumble, you then can use monetary policy to support the economy. So for now, our advice to most of the countries in the region is that there's still a bit of room, but maybe it's prudent to start tightening or normalizing your monetary policy, and also to withdraw the fiscal stimulus that was put into place in the last 2 years, because as pointed out by Minister, the debt in the region, especially the sovereign debt, has gone up very sharply, and so there's a lot of concern about the burden of the debt on the government, and whether there might be a risk. Our assessment is that even though the debt stock is quite high, most of it is financed through domestic savings. So if you look across the region, external financing of domestic debt is quite low, and much of the financing actually is because domestic demand collapsed, financial savings went up, and a lot of that savings went to finance the deficit. Right? But of course, now that the economy is picking up, the government should pull back and allow the private sector to borrow more. Otherwise, there's a bit of crowding out effect, as we call it. So we don't really see that there's high risk of sovereign debt distress in the region. I think overall, the government in the region has managed this shock relatively well. They have, put in the necessary support in terms of fiscal support, financial support for the household and the private sector, so that because there's a liquidity crunch basically when you lock down the economy, and that has kept the economy moving. And now it's time to pull back and let the economy grow, the private sector take over the reign of. So this year, for that reason, we're quite comfortable that growth will remain relatively strong. So if you can look at this chart here, you see that we on the left-hand side, ASEAN +3, then we have the +3, which is China, Korea, and Japan. And then we have the ASEAN countries on the far right. You can see that China had a very strong, that's the red bar, very strong spike up last year. They had a very strong rebound. And so this year, they're normalizing in terms of the growth rate. But this is taken from our last flagship report, so the growth there is still quite strong. And this year, we expect growth to come down to 5.2 in our flagship report, although we are reviewing the forecast now. And we're going to be coming out with an update of that early next month. And on the right, and on the third bar are ASEAN countries. And you can see the red bar is much much lower, right? And that's because of the Delta Omicron, Delta wave last year, which basically derailed the recovery that we were hoping. In some sense, China is going through that early this year, what ASEAN countries went through third quarter of last year. So this year, we expect the growth to surge to about 5.1% for this year and 5.2% for next year. And we have been studying the impact of the war on the growth prospect for the region. And we're still quite comfortable that we don't have to revise it down. For a while, we thought that because of China and the impact on the region. I mean, I think somebody showed a chart earlier that the spillover from China on countries in the region is quite high. But we did our own simulation, and it shows that actually the multiplier is not as strong. But nevertheless, if China does go into a severe downturn, it's going to impact everybody. Until we already know that countries like Vietnam, Korea, Japan, they are affected by this slowdown in China in terms of availability of supplies and because of the disruption to the. So, but luckily, the infection has subsided. And so already we see from the leading index like PMI that growth is recovering in China. So I think the second half of this year we're going to see a very strong rebound in China. Now whether it's going to get them back to 5.2, it's going to be a question. We are reviewing the figures, and we think that they can probably bring it up close to 5 for next year or this year. So that would help to support the region as well. And also, but the downside of this is that because if China were to rebound very strongly, it will put pressure on commodity prices, and that will lead to higher inflation as well. So trade-off here. So let me stop here.
Yeah, Hui, so on that note, I just wanted to jump in just now when you mentioned it's quite a positive note somewhat towards the second half, but what's your view on the zero COVID strategy out of China? Do you think when will it end? Is there a specific timeline that you have a view on? And what does that mean? And then coincidentally also, 2022 is the 25th anniversary of the Asian crisis. And how does that fit in with this 25th anniversary? Of course, you don't want it to be happening, a recession to happen in the 25th anniversary, but what's its impact on ASEAN? I think Alvin mentioned it, and Professor Tan Kong Yam mentioned currencies didn't have moved, but it hasn't moved as much as before. So your views, Hui?
Well, let me start with the China zero COVID policy. I a lot of people have said that this is not sustainable. But if you look at the zero COVID policy, back to 2020, they've been very successful in containing the infection until the last most recent wave. So and that's the reason why growth was able to rebound so strongly last year. But they got hit by the Delta or Omicron infection, and because of that they had to shut down Shanghai. They have to Guangdong was relatively open, but Beijing also got shut down, and that led to a very severe downturn in economic activity and also disruption across the world. In some sense, that's what happened to I think ASEAN countries, as I said, in the quarter of last year. But they have managed to contain it, and now the infection rate is very low. And I think in the process they have learned, to recalibrate the containment measures so that it's not as severe or as strict. And so going forward, my sense is that the Chinese will refine the zero COVID policy, recalibrate the containment policy to open up the borders more, because the border is affecting ASEAN countries. I think somebody mentioned that earlier also, because the region is very dependent on Chinese tourists to recover to boost the tourism sector. And already the infection rate has subsided across the whole region. The population are highly vaccinated, so the cases are continuing to go down. So at some point, I think the Chinese government will also will realize that maybe they also have to open up, because the risk of imported infection is much lower now. And they also recalibrate the containment policy to screen the arrivals so that it doesn't infect the local population. At the same time, allowing more of the and that I think will be a boost for the whole region because countries like Thailand, Cambodia are very dependent on Chinese tourists.
So what do you think
On the-
timeline 3 months, 1 month, 6 months? Just want to get
My sense is maybe towards the end of the year.
Okay.
There's a very important meeting.
On the Asian crisis.
But it's not static. I think I think the policy will evolve over time. And on the the Asian financial crisis, I think we all should be very proud. I think it was a very traumatic event, and we wrote a book on it, and it's called Trauma to Triumph. It was devastating. I was here. I came to Singapore in 1996, just a year before the crisis broke, and it really devastated a lot of lives in the region. But I think to the credit of the region, I think they learned the lesson. They said never again would they allow this to happen again. And so they rebuilt the economy, they rebuilt the balance sheet, they strengthened their financial system, the rebuilt policy space, they strengthened the regulatory framework. So they did a lot of things, right, over the last 20 years to strengthen the system so that they would never have fallen into another such trap. So when you look at what happened during the COVID, there was a very strong outflow in March, right? When because of the strong risk aversion, but then it subsided, and since then, I think there were relatively, pockets of outflow now and then, but on balance, the outflow was quite low, and they were able to rebuild the foreign reserve, and foreign reserve actually is much stronger now than pre-COVID. So they are actually sitting quite well positioned now to, in case there's another shock and risk aversion, and there's another outflow. So I have to give credit to the policymakers, for really taking the lessons of the Asian financial crisis seriously and doing the necessary reform, the bitter medicine they call it, in order to strengthen their immunity against these kind of shocks.
So, so looks like there's a lot of relations between ASEAN as well as improved since then. But let me go towards Harbin. Harbin, first question, do you agree with Hoi's slides with the ASEAN growth in the second half? Because you probably can share with us more details about specific countries in ASEAN. But I think since the title today is Dancing with Giants and how Singapore can manage this bifurcated world, what's your view on the Singapore economy? I think MOS Alvin just now shared about how trade is key, and he has been visiting Mexico, Mercosur, and visiting North America. FTAs are key, trade is a key area. So what's your view about the Singapore's outlook over the next 5 to 10, 15, 20 years, and what it means for Singapore, especially from what Deborah and Hoi's mentioned?
Okay, that's quite a lot there. I mean, on ASEAN, I think the positive signs are clearly from the reopening. We've got this incredible growth boost that's lifting growth dramatically in the first quarter, and I think that will persist in the second quarter. I think the other big positive that's very clear is the supply chains, that even during the pandemic, you see the FDI interest and applications just surging in ASEAN. Some of the numbers are pretty dramatic, for electronics in Malaysia, Indonesia, soaring clearly on the commodity space, and of course Singapore has been stand out in terms of capital flows. I think if you told me, 6 months ago, that China was going to go into contraction in April and May, as indicated by the PMI numbers, and there would be such severe lockdowns, I would have thought that ASEAN's growth, exports, manufacturing would have taken a tumble. I think what is remarkable is that they actually stayed above 50. They continued to expand. So I think the part of it, I think, is just in China, it's just a suppression of demand, and that so some of that will come back and drive, but also the diversion of orders. I think some of this has come to Vietnam, sort of Malaysia electronics, and that's also provided some support. And of course, the structure of ASEAN exports, right? Commodities don't really depend on components, or Singapore semiconductors doesn't really matter. So for the most part, it's done pretty well. On the concern about whether Singapore or ASEAN is sandwiched between now two different mansions. It seems like on the contrary, we're kind of benefiting, right, from being that in that middle space. Clearly, ASEAN Singapore wants to be part of WTO. We're still on, if that was the CPTPP, we're still on it. But we are also signed on the Asian Infrastructure Bank. We're part of the RCEP. We're part of the Belt and Road. So we got feet, on both sides, of these two mansions that's growing. And I think it's clearly in, even a bifurcated world, ASEAN is able to dance and so far find its space. I mean, for overall, of course, I think the headwinds are pretty dramatic, are pretty large, right? I mean, we've got the inflation shock that's eating into household budgets. It's likely to be pretty painful for the low-income group. We've got the interest rate shock. I've got my mortgage bills coming out, and the banks are all raising interest rate by 75 bips, and that's only the start of it. In the next year or so, it's probably going to go up by another 200 bips. I'm not sure whether that many Singaporeans, younger generation, has seen mortgage rates of 4%, but I think that's where we're heading towards. And then lastly, of course, this risk of recessions in Europe, possibly in US, of course in China as well. So growth momentum still pretty decent, outperforming China, the rest of the world, but definitely slowing in the second half for me. I mean, I think Singapore has stood up pretty well. We had already a very sharp recovery. Maybe from Singapore's strengths, I think, if I look back 3 years, what has really changed? 3 things kind of stand out for me. One is that the government is extremely generous in terms of what it's willing to dish out support, not just for Singapore companies, but for MNCs, right? So when you break down and look at the size of the 60 over billion of reserves that drew upon, that's about 12% of GDP, that was pretty dramatic, and that provided a lot of support. It was almost like an insurer of last resort, which I think secures Singapore's place. Second, of course, is this supply chain story, which continues to come to ASEAN. I think not just the trade war, but clearly what's happening in Ukraine and down the pandemic shock and the China lockdowns have reinforced the movement of supply chains to ASEAN, and Singapore will benefit from that as well. And then thirdly, I think, of course, now looking back as well, Hong Kong's position is changing very quickly, right? Hong Kong, I don't think, has the flexibility. Hong Kong has to follow the kind of policies that, that China sets. And therefore, I think that's a great advantage for Singapore that has had to compete in talent, in taxes, and so on. And that, I think, seals Singapore's place permanently as the international financial center in Asia. So I think all that said, growth is slowing, but I think for the longer term, Singapore seems to be coming out of this in a far better, stronger shape.
Our view have been, the Sing dollar has been quite strong. So that sort of a macro policy mix will probably continue for the next 6 to 12 months, I suppose.
I mean, MES is clearly, first out the door in terms of tightening. It's tightened 3 times with a surprise out of a meeting move. Inflation still is extremely high. Headline is 5% over. The next meeting is October. But I think for the most part, the risk is towards further tightening, to cope with inflation. So Sing dollar has already outperformed most other currencies and will probably, to me, stay that way.
Thanks. So I think we want to sort of segue into this issue about global value chains and food protectionism. So these are issues, I mean, the past 3 panels keep mentioning about chicken. So it is a main issue, food protectionism, the global value chain shifts, the regionalization, I think, which I asked Deborah earlier. So Hui, the global value chain, do you think it will continue to be like this? Will it change? What's your view over the next 6 to 12 months? It's quite important, I think, to get to know this.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that we are very concerned. And last year, the year before, we did a study on the global value chain. And we came to the conclusion, that was before the war broke out, but I think the view is still whole, which is that the global value chain is so complex and so efficient that it's very hard for you to, pull out, to dismantle or even to bifurcate the value chain. So I can see, for instance, countries, inshoring or reshoring some products here and there. But the vast majority of the products in the value chain, I think will continue to trade, and countries, the smaller countries like ASEAN, will continue to be able to, specialize, on particular product that takes care of its comparative advantage and be able to trade with the rest of the world. And I don't see the countries, having to choose side. If they have to come to choose side, then I think, we have a risk. Then the house might burn down and crumble. But until then, I mean, the Biden policy towards China has been cooperation, competition, and confrontation, right? So I think that leaves enough space for a lot of smaller countries, basically, to compete. I think most of the relation with China, I think we also heard it from earlier this morning, is that they don't want to tear down the house. They basically want to be able to confront China where they think is in the national security. But for the vast majority of the product, I think they will continue to compete with China, and we see that also in the way they impose sanctions on certain companies and not on other companies. And also, despite this tariff that you mentioned earlier, I think was very shooting yourself on the foot, because it hurts the U.S. consumer more than it hurts the Chinese producer. And so it did have an effect, because I think there's a diversion of trade from China to other parts of the world. But overall demand in the U.S. is so strong that if you look at overall export of China to the U.S., they run a much bigger trade surplus last year than the year before, right? So there's still room, I think, in the way they are confronting each other for smaller countries, to maneuver. So in terms of the global value, I think it'll be reconfigured. It'll be maybe more polarized. Now we have RCEP, and actually RCEP is very timely, because I think it will strengthen the global value chain, the regional value chain, because basically it allows input to be moved around the region without tariff, and and also the common window. Maybe Deborah can elaborate on that. Also allows. So I think that is actually a framework that allows the region to become even stronger in terms of building up the supply chain within the region. And the region is extremely competitive, so it's very hard for any other region to replicate this region.
Thanks, Hui. I just want to now move into, we've been talking a lot about China. I think Hui touched a bit about US. I think, Deborah, you rightly pointed out some years back that when Biden wins, he might not remove the Trump, and you were right, pointedly right on that front. But maybe you can share us a bit more about the US politics and US trade sort of outlook going forward, and what it means. You were there, you were back in the US recently. Can you share with us a bit more about what the environment there is and how it's going to go forward in terms of tariffs or sanctions or developments?
Sure. With the caveat, obviously, that I don't control Biden. So I think on the U.S.-China tariffs, they're still in place. Most of the tariffs that were levied back and forth starting in 2018 remain in place here in 2022. But we have a window of opportunity right now for the reduction of many of those tariffs. And I think particularly people who are thinking about this from an investment point of view, there are three key timelines that I would pay attention to. So White House is completely focused on US midterm elections in the beginning of November. So the goal is to assess just about everything you can in the context of those midterm elections. Those elections are likely to go badly for the Democrats. So how can you maintain as much control over Congress as possible in those elections? One way to do so is to deal with inflation, which is becoming a very real problem. And that means that there's not a lot of levers that you can pull. If you're the White House in particular, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But one thing you could do that looks good, that may result in some changes, is to suspend some of the tariff rate increases with the Chinese, on Chinese imports. Because the US moved from largely zero tariffs roughly to 25% overnight, as many of you may have sadly discovered at the time. And they've stuck since then. So when then would the United States remove tariffs? Officially, not at all until the Chinese government upholds the commitments in this phase 1 trade agreement. Unofficially, they have been limiting the application for some companies for some products throughout the duration. You could apply for an exemption. But we are now at a point where you could have the government can temporarily suspend the application of tariffs. The net result is that you wouldn't pay tariffs. So when will they do that? Well, I suspect that in August, we will see tariffs coming off anything and everything that fits in the shopping cart of a back-to-school parent. So that means tariffs, they're not high, they're 7.5% right now, but on every pencils, notebooks, crayons, children's footwear, children's backpacks, clothing for kids, like all that stuff that a parent appreciates when they go in August to buy school supplies. The US school year starts in September. So you want to limit that basket of inflationary goods to as low a rate as you can. So I suspect we will see the first round of tariff reductions in August for back to school. The second round, they will try, if they're going to do a second round, to target the election. So I would guess in October, you would make an announcement about a few less consumer-facing products that are not in the children's basket. So pick anything else that has tariffs, and many of those tariffs can be at 15 to 25% right now. The last batch of tariffs, I think, will not be removed until best case scenario is the spring, because they're going to wait for the midterm elections to see what happens. They're going to wait for the Party Congress in China, and then they have to restart conversations, because you can't remove that last batch of tariffs, including on steel and aluminum, until you've had a conversation between the two sides. And I just think that that's going to be delayed until the end of this year, beginning of next year. So there will, I suspect, be tariff reductions in, my guess is, those three phases. And I would anticipate firms will have to decide whether they pass those savings along to their customers or whether they pocket the difference. But the point is that you will have had a public announcement, you will talk about it, you will talk about why it makes a difference. So we should see, fingers crossed, some tariff changes in between the US and China in the near term.
So in fact, Deborah, they just moved on the solar panels, right?
Yes.
Biden just removed the
Removed it
temporarily.
It's going to be
temporarily.
It will be temporary. The reason it's temporary, in part, is so that they can reimpose them, but also because any permanent change in tariffs requires Congress. Any temporary adjustment is something that the White House can do on their own. So it'll be a temporary adjustment, pending some long-term something, so that you figure out however you're going to phrase that.
Thanks, Deborah. So at this point, I think we've got some towards the end point. I was wondering whether we can get the questions via Slido.
I think they're on your...
They're not here, but I've...
Not there. Oh, you want your...
Yeah, maybe for those that want to ask questions, they can actually already post their questions. But I have a few here already. Oh yeah, I think there's one question for you. Can you share with us about the reserves diversification away from the US dollar? How soon will it happen, and how will the shift from US Treasuries affect emerging economies?
I think it's been going on for some time. If you look at the data, the share of holding in US dollar assets went down from 70% to 60%, right? So countries have been diversifying to higher yielding assets, and all that. But that's a bit different from the dominance of the US dollar in financial markets and in trade, because trade is only a small portion of the total transaction. But diversification is not easy because you need an asset that's safe, liquid, and besides the US dollar, you have the euro, right? And increasingly yen and other convertible currencies. So a lot of people have speculated maybe China is going to try to diversify away from the US dollar, and they have been diversifying. But where do you diversify to, right? You diversify euro or some other currencies, convertible currencies. But the holding is still about 1 trillion. I think that's the estimate for Chinese holding of US assets. And a lot of people thought maybe diversification will be to the renminbi, right? But that very much depends on the financial markets in China. And we did see, I think, over $500 billion of inflows into China last year, right? The data shows. So as the financial markets in China grows, there will be more and more, investors moving, and also central bank moving their assets, investing in Chinese assets. But at the moment, the big markets is US, Europe, and Japan to some extent, and the renminbi is not convertible, although it's been a very strong asset, so far. So that so diversification will take time. It will not happen overnight. So the only other diversification away from financial assets is to real assets, right? And we know alternative assets have been booming. You have the cryptocurrencies, you have the NPT, you have all kinds of new assets propping up, but they are not systemic. I mean, they are big enough to be able to play the role of the US dollar in today's world. So I think it's a trend that's going to go on, but it will take time for for diversification. I think if it goes below 50%, it will be a real sign that diversification.
There's a follow-up question. Which 2-3 currency assets are most likely? When you mentioned a few just now, but the follow-up question today is 2 to 3 currency. Which are the 2-3 currency assets most likely away from the US dollar? I think you mentioned some of them.
Well, it's pretty obvious that China, the RMB will be one of them. If we're talking about emerging markets, because outside the emerging market world, the usual currency, Euro, Japan, and the other economies are just not big enough. The financial markets are not big enough to be able to play that role. And China is big and it's growing, and over time the financial market will be even bigger than the US. So at some point, it's a very viable alternative for many countries.
There's one question here about Taiwan. Professor Tan, mentioned about today and also yesterday's FT article talk about the risk of China invading Taiwan. So I think I'll open it up to the whole floor here, panel. Do the panelists view this as a real threat, and how will this impact ASEAN? In terms of China risk, I think Professor Kong Yang mentioned it earlier. But in terms of from a trade perspective, I suppose.
Yeah, I basically agree with Kong Yang, that actually, ironically, the war in Ukraine may reduce the temperature, although, because of the lessons that people draw from Ukraine. Although at the same time, there's the other side, which is that the US is also beefing up Taiwan. So, this is an area where I hope, common sense prevail, and we never had to get into a war, because the war is the most destructive. But I'm really basically optimistic that given time, the problem will resolve itself in a peaceful way.
Thanks. Deborah, I think there's one question, and maybe I pose this to you and Deborah and Harbin. Besides trade integration, which other synergies can ASEAN rely to fortify regional resilience in terms of energy security? I think given the decoupling globally, I think it relates to the first question, but it's a very specific question about regional resilience from a trade perspective. If you're a trade official, Deborah, what would you?
Well, I think again, what ASEAN has done very well is it's created its own regional supply chains, regional value chains, which are proving to be quite durable. And they're built on a number of things. They're built on, personal connectivity between firms in the region. They're built on the ability to travel around the region, not COVID notwithstanding. They're built on a set of rules and policies that create sort of integrated abilities to do that. They're built on companies who can deliver services of all different kinds between markets in the region. And I think that has been very useful for ASEAN. And I think, as we mentioned, the supply chains have stayed fairly resilient, particularly the supply chains in and around this region. Even at the height of the US-China trade war, we didn't see a lot of challenges affecting ASEAN-based chains. COVID has had challenges, but the challenges are not unique to here. They're sort of general COVID problems. And so I suspect that the region is in relatively good shape, with one possible sort of thing on the horizon, which is, I don't think we're going to get decoupling, as in I don't think this nearshoring, friendshoring, reshoring thing works particularly well, because ultimately companies are the ones that do that, and companies at the moment are not driven to absorb the costs that it would take to reshore or friendshore or nearshore, unless there's economic reasons for doing so. They're not going to do it just because government says we would like it if you did that. They need an economic reason to do so. But what would make a difference for firms, well, two things. So one is government policy, because government can wreck your whole business plan in an instant if they choose to do so, or if they do it by accident. So there are ways for governments to regulate and make it difficult for you to continue to service different kinds of customers or suppliers, whatever. So government policy could affect this. And second, and this is where I think the decoupling might matter, if we have technology decoupling or a continued pressure for tech separation, that could be very problematic for ASEAN. I think it's done a very good job of dancing with its giants so far, and has proven very resilient in the way that it can flexibly move around, different kinds of things. But I think a tech decoupling, especially driven by regulatory policies by governments, could make it much more challenging than many ASEAN companies seem to appreciate, for them to continue to be in two places. So it would be very hard to service the US, the China market, the European market with the same procedures, processes, parts, components, whatever it is that you're trying to make. I think that would be challenging.
Thanks, Jeff. We have about 5 minutes left, and I just want to make sure I have the two questions that's been raised quickly, and probably get quick answers from maybe first Hak Bin. There's a question here about which ASEAN country has the best macro outlook for 2023. And maybe the second question I'll open up to the floor is about digital. No panel session on ASEAN can run away from the question about ASEAN digital common currency, or e-currency, or renminbi, e-renminbi that has been seen. So maybe two views on that before we end, and then I'll summarize. Bin, the macro outlook. Which one is your best bet?
But maybe just going back to that trade question. I'm not a trade expert, but I thought one of the issues about building the stronger ASEAN is actually is the issue of labor. I thought one of the things that's really stood out in the last 2-3 years is that even though we're out of this pandemic, we're doing living with COVID, we're all struggling with labor issues. Indonesia just, I don't know, for whatever reason, suspended 30,000 workers from going back to Malaysia. Right? The reason wasn't very clear to me. Singapore seems to be struggling to get a lot of construction workers coming back. In fact, even for Vietnam, who has recovered really strongly, when you look at the labor participation rate, it's still like 3-4 percentage points, depending on what number you look at. In fact, as much as 10% when you look at the urban labor participation rate, most are not going back to the factories. So I don't know whether there's a way to improve that labor mobility between ASEAN countries that would actually strengthen the resilience and recovery on that part. So that seems to be one of the permanent scarring effects of the pandemic. On which country will do best? Well, my bet is Vietnam. I think it's very straightforward. I think clearly when you look at the dynamism, where they stand, where they are very open, and it's just like Singapore. Actually, trade export to GDP now for Vietnam is 100%, right, 120%. They are intent on diversification. They have investments from many countries. It's not concentrated on one. And very clearly, they have a country that's large enough, the labor pool size, and very driven to actually get investments in. So, if I have to pick one, it would probably be Vietnam.
Thanks. Last question on the e-currency that the client on common digital currency. And any views from the panel?
Well, I think one of the positive things that coming out of COVID is the boost to digital technology. So as a result of the COVID shutdown, every country now has some form of digital currency, e-payment system, and all that. I guess what you're referring to is the central bank digital currency, which I think China has pioneered in some sense, and also I think, but many countries in the region are looking at it very seriously. And the question is, what role is going to play? I mean, in the case of China, it's basically a retail payment system, right? But I think here in Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and Philippines, they're basically connecting their e-payment system, which is not digital currency, but probably more important that you're able to have one common system, which means you got to set up the infrastructure, the rules, the regulation, and all that to facilitate payment across cross-border payment, and that would be actually a big boost to tourism. Eventually, they may get to central bank digital currency, but at the moment, I think it's not compelling what the advantage would be in terms of the central bank having a digital currency, because at the moment the e-payment system seems pretty efficient to me at least. That the additional advantage of having the central bank develop this digital currency is not very, unless eventually I think the one that the PBOC is developing is also together with UAE and a few other countries, and the idea is to explore wholesale digital payment across border, and that when it happens will be actually quite significant.
And it's linked to what you mentioned for Deborah in terms of the window that's probably within ASEAN with ASEAN plus 6 as well. So
Yes, but I would say that, you'd have to pool sovereignty for that, and ASEAN is not known for pooling sovereignty. So we might maybe get a payment system that's interoperable, but I don't think you're going to pool sovereignty anytime soon.
all right, so we have 1 minute left, and if there are any last thoughts from the panel, if not, I'll wrap up. And I think I've answered most all the questions. I tried to get as many questions from the floor as possible through the Slido, and I thank all the questions that have been sent in. It's good, lively discussion from all the questions from the floor as well as among the panelists, and I think they've covered a wide range of questions. In fact, I think way beyond what the focus of US and China is, especially digital currencies and beyond that. But I just want to highlight what Deborah started off is about mentions. I think probably started with Professor Tan Kong Yam, and it's probably nicely segued into the whole afternoon. Building mentions, there will be fire and embers, but I think what Hui highlighted about the growth in ASEAN in the second half seems to be still quite positive. But there's also some positive elements out of China, the zero COVID removal, and Hui shared on that front. But Deborah shared about the removal of US tariffs might come, but probably not in a big way anytime soon this year, but later on. And then to end off on Singapore's front, Harbin nicely pointed out, Singapore has the fiscal support, will be exposed to supply chain vulnerabilities, but also because of the changes outside of Singapore, Hong Kong, the position changing rapidly, and also benefits Singapore in total. So those sort of contexts helps to build up sort of slightly positive view in some ways in the second half, but of course there are vulnerabilities, as Hui mentioned in his slide, which was a nice summary of the various vulnerabilities and risks. And hopefully everybody got a chance to have a look at Hui's slides, which sort of nicely summarized everything. So on that note, I would like to thank Deborah, Hui, Harbin for a very lively discussion. And hopefully we covered sufficient ground so that you can answer some of your questions, because trade is the lifeblood of ASEAN. Trade is the lifeblood of any country, but we in ASEAN are very open economies. So all this will have an impact both from investments and also in terms of political cycles and also in terms of investment decisions going forward. So on that note, thank you very much and hope you have a wonderful next few sessions after this. Thank you.